Welcome of Caffe della Scienza, organized by the Italian Consulate General of Italy. Today coincides with the 7th edition of the Week of the Italian Cuisine in the World, and the theme for this year is conviviality, sustainability, and innovation. I'm very pleased today to introduce you our new Consul General of Italy, Mauro Lorenzini.
Thank you. Actually, I came just because I was very interested to see the Caffe della Scienza since I'm here, like I've been here for 1 month. So I'm afraid that I cannot give like a proper introduction about science, also because I'm not a scientist. But I was very interested in meeting you and see the event, the reunion that has been organized tonight, because Caffe della Scienza is going to be something that's going to be very important also in the future. We are planning to do a monthly meeting with Caffe della Scienza, and also we would like suggestions from you for the theme, for whatever you have to as a suggestion to make the Caffe della Scienza. I would like it like more and more interactive, and an opportunity to share your stories as Italian scientists, Italian researchers, or people who are not Italian, but in somehow, some way connected with Italy. So this would be the intention, the objective of Caffe della Scienza, to create a network, to create contacts between among Italian scientists in the area of the consulate. So Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma. Already Texas is huge, so and already Houston is a very big town with many scientific institutions. So I know the objective is really, maybe impossible, but we're going to work on this. So to create a network, to create contacts. Why? Because you, the Italian scientists, the Italian researchers here, are a resource for Italy. And you are an instrument, an opportunity for Italy to strengthen the cooperation, the bilateral cooperation in the field of science with the US. That for Italy it's a priority, especially now with the merging of lots of new technologies, and especially in the field of space, but not only space, in the field of medicine and physics. So our intention is to try to strengthen the bilateral cooperation. There is an important agreement, bilateral agreement between Italy and the US that is going to be renewed early next year, and there's going to be a new joint declaration. So a document that is going to be agreed by Italy and the US, where the two countries are going to share their objectives in bilateral cooperation in the field of science. And you are the protagonist. You are, the Italians that are involved in science in Texas and in the United States. I know that many of you have studied also in other cities. So that's why Caffe della Scienza, that's why we want to assist you also, to be close to you. The consulate is is the house of all the Italians, and so especially for you, for whatever needs or whatever things that you want to organize or needs that you have in your private life, the consulate is there. And it's there also to organize these opportunities to meet, to share our stories, and to talk about science. So it's really a pleasure to be here, to meet you. I already spoken with some of you, and I hope that the panel tonight is going to be interesting, useful, and I'm also going to listen, so I hope to learn something, since I don't have a scientific background. So, buon lavoro a tutti.
Thank you so much, Consul General. Thank you, because you are gonna learn very fast how dynamic is this community on every single area of academia, med, engineering, cultural. You're gonna be very surprised. I hope everybody will not disappoint you. So, me included. Let me introduce Dr. Tiziano Barberi. Dr. Tiziano Barberi is a founder and CEO of the Lab Farm Food Incorporation. He's doing something really interesting. Dr. Barberi's scientific career was focused on the study of stem cells and their differentiation. This topic is very close to me because my husband is in the same field. And is a PhD in cell biology, many years in academia, and in 2019 he left academia and founded a company in the emerging field of cellular agriculture. He is applying his expertise in stem cell production to produce meat in a lab. Wow. Basically, very soon, cultured meat will be another alternative protein product, such as plant-based meat. So growing animal cells to produce meat in a laboratory really represents an ethical and more sustainable alternative to animal slaughtering. So, Dr. Barbieri, now we are here to hear this very interesting, area of producing, different way of meat.
So thank you for the introduction and the invitation. Fortunately, what I will talk about has very little, nothing to do with our fantastic Italian cuisine, but it's still a topic and something that it will be part of our future, and a different way to make food. So let me start on what is the problem that we have now. Among others, we have this big problem that the massive animal farming is causing a lot of pollution and greenhouse gases, for instance, and also the drain of a lot of natural resources. We need a lot of water to just to feed the animals. So it's something that it's becoming worse and worse. Not to mention the conditions on which the animals are kept. So very inhumane, and everything it's becoming really unsustainable. This is the problem now. But not many people think that the global demand for meat, it's actually increasing at the same time. Even though we treat the animals so bad, the actually demand for meat is increasing. So what can we do to change this trend and to go back to an ethical way to make food and to sustainable, and that helps to keep our planet safe and our animals? So I think that as many of you, not recently, now in a few years, you will notice in the supermarkets now showing up in the shelves a lot of new different products. These products that are all called combined plant-based meat products, I call them fake meat, because to me the word plant and meat, they cannot go together. But anyway, those products, they're actually expanding. So mostly based on plant proteins. For instance, Impossible Burgers, it's actually made of potato and green peas proteins compressed to form a patty, like a regular burger. And then there are other products, though, like the eggs that I don't actually know how they're made, and I don't want to know because they look too close to the real ones. And then there are emerging another, in addition to plant, another source of this fake to make products of fake milk and meat alternatives. So that is the mycelium. The mycelium is a fungus that is actually very good for a lot of other purposes, not just for food, but it's actually so very flexible, the use. And now they're making a lot of products based on that, adding flavoring and other things. You can see here bacon and crab cakes, all based on mycelium. But anyway, so this is what we have at the moment on the shelves as an alternative to avoid or to minimize or to start minimizing the slaughtering of the animals and decrease the pollution that derives from the massive animal farming. So, but what can we do in addition to that? So if we go back to 2013, a Dutch scientist named Mark Post showed us that we could grow cells in a lab and make a burger for the little amount of money of $325,000. So his project was backed by the Google founders, but of course the price of the burger it's prohibitive and doesn't make sense. But on the other hand, this was the first demonstration that we can actually start thinking to grow cells from the animals without really harming the animals and grow them and make meat products in the lab that they then can be sold and used as an alternative food. And they have the same, protein values and nutritional values as meat. So, but what is generally culture meat? So culture meat here, I took a scheme. You can find on Google, you can find now dozens of that. But this is again from Mark Post, more recent, and it's really simple and start to explain what is culture meat. So you start from an animal, you get some cells, different types. So you can either just do a biopsy and get the muscles directly from the animal, or you can get any kind of cells and then reprogram them to make stem cells. And then once you have the stem cell, you can differentiate into muscle. So you will end up with a bunch of cells in a petri dish. And then, of course, with that, you don't do anything, but then you will grow them in what is called a bioreactor. A bioreactor is just a very, very large cell incubator. So bioreactor, you will grow those cells, and then you will extract them and transform or process to make a product that is like a sort of, for a burger or a chicken nuggets, depending on the animal cells that you're using. The alternative is, if you want more texture, you can use new emerging technologies, not anymore emerging, established technology like bioprinting or the addition of edible scaffolds and make something that resembles a thing that is more familiar to us rather than a burger, a steak. So adding texture, but using still the cells, but adding the texture to have a steak. So what happened in the years after 2013, after this demonstration? So in 2015, 2014, the first company started to show up. Then this is just to give you an idea how this landscape is changing over time. So in 2016, there were only a few, really, you can count them in the palm of your hand, a full company that were around, not just in the US, but around the world globally, doing culture meat. Now, 2021, you can see how many are they. Actually, this list is not even complete, but it's just to give you an idea how this is expanded. Many people started to see this new technology as an opportunity and to try to make some food in a sustainable way, but using and having the same things that you would have from conventional meat, from an animal. So in addition to companies that are dedicated to making culture meat and growing cells, more recently, so from 2018 on, other companies started to show up in the space, to join the space. And this company actually are all dedicated to tackle, to try to address one of the challenges that are actually being a problem for the development of the cultured meat industry. So there are companies that are now making cultured media components. So the medium is where the cells, the liquid medium is where the cells are growing. It's a culture medium. Basically, it has the nutrients, and it's like if it's mimicking the nutrients that are circulating in our blood, and they go to all the tissues, to all the cells, to keep the cells alive, happy, their metabolism on, and whatever function they have active. So other companies are trying to make bioreactors for this process. That is the key and central part of the cultured meat. Bioreactors are not a new thing. They exist since a long time. We make recombinant proteins since a very long time by using yeast or other microorganisms, and then that we genetically engineer to produce some protein of interest, human or other animal proteins, and then grow them in massive scale in this bioreactor so they can produce a lot of proteins, and then they get purified. They're also used for therapeutic, for making for growing B cells, that they produce antibodies, the immunoglobulin that they can be used for therapeutic use. Now growing T cells that are first exposed to tumor antigens, so to instruct the T cells to then target a tumor when you put them back in the patient. And also scaffolds. Scaffolds, why scaffold? Because as I showed you in the previous slide, the culture meat, the cells that don't have per se a lot of texture, no matter how close you go to a muscle tissue. So if we can add a little bit of something that gives texture in terms of some edible scaffolds, some nanofibers or other means, so that's another thing that we need. And so all these companies are welcome because they are only dedicated to the cultured meat space. So the costs are minimal, and they can really help to the development of the cultured meat space as it all. So now we have to understand, though, that growing muscle is not as simple as growing other cell types, because muscle is a complex tissues. Of course, what we know is when we cut a steak or we eat a burger, we eat a chunk of muscle tissue. But in our body and the body of the animals, the muscle is not born as tissue, but especially during embryogenesis, the muscle is formed initially as a mass of muscle progenitors. Those progenitors, they are proliferative. Then they start to turn into intermediate cell types. The first one is the myoblasts that are still proliferative. Then they become myocytes, so terminal differentiated muscle cells. The myocytes are the ones that will start to fuse together, and they will form the myofibers. And a muscle tissue, it's billions of myofibers. So in vitro, we call the myofibers myotubes. So, but that's what we need to do. If you want to make a cultured meat product, that's what we have to do. So, like I said, the only proliferative cells in the muscle line are the progenitors and to some extent the myoblasts. So those are the ones that we can expand in the bioreactors, because as you saw from the 2013 burger of Mark Post, growing them in regular tissue culture setting in a lot of tissue culture flasks, it would take just one room, fill up with flasks just to make a little burger or a nugget with a prohibitive cost. So what we have to do, we have to grow and expand the progenitors in a bioreactor. But the bioreactors, of course, needs to be suitable for this kind of cells, and it will take also medium, and the medium has also have to be optimized for that. But the process doesn't end here, because what we really want are the myotubes, are the myofibers, so to make a piece of meat. Only the mature and fused myocytes and myotubes have the proteins and everything that is in the tissue. So if we would eat and grow just muscle progenitors, we wouldn't have the same nutritional values and the same taste and the same properties of a piece of meat. So that's what we need to do. So, but we believe, so this is part of a slide from my company. What we do, we grow the progenitors suspended in a bioreactor. So they form a sort of sphere, so they aggregate or they grow, in this interesting way. But once that we reach the number that we think it's sufficient for us to do a little test or a small chunk of meat, then we have to move them to another way of growing, that it can be still a bioreactor, but a completely different one, because what we need to do now, we'll have to have the differentiation of the cells and then the fusion to make the myotubes that are here. So when I say differentiation, it occurs spontaneously if we change the medium, the culture medium in the bioreactor, but we also have means to accelerate and make this process more efficiently. In particular, in my company, we use some small molecules that are inhibitor of certain cell pathways, and by inhibiting and play with those, we can force the progenitors to differentiate, terminally differentiate, stop dividing, and fuse to form the myotubes. So this is actually a video of what we have in my company in the lab. So those are spontaneously contracting chicken muscle myotubes. So what we did, we grew the cells, the progenitors, we let them grow, then they differentiate, and then they fuse, so they form these myotubes. And because they have an embryonic origin, the muscle can spontaneously twitch in a culture dish rather than an adult muscle that wouldn't do it. It's just a detail that doesn't make any difference if it twitches or not, but just to show you that this is actually part of what we ate a couple of years ago as a prototype. So it was something like that. It was a mass of disorganized, though, myotubes contracting in some culture dishes. So, but okay, so culture meat looks like very straightforward. So you just grow muscle progenitors, you go into in a bioreactor, then you move to a different vessel, different bioreactor, different setting, you let them differentiate and fuse together and make the myofibers, and that's all you need to do. Yes, theoretically, that's the only thing we would need to do. But what happened is that growing muscle progenitors, expanding them, it's not the easiest thing to do. So you need to know, to have a special medium recipe and know the factors, the growth factors that they would allow them to proliferate but not differentiate. So we have this technology in my company, but many other companies, they don't do that. They took a sort of shortcut. So what they did, they started with all the big purposes on growing muscle, but then they ended up on growing cells called mostly, not all of them, but many companies growing cells called fibroblasts that are actually, that have nothing to do with meat. They grow fast, especially if they are immortalized or transformed. They're cheaper to grow than muscle cells because the medium, they don't require special medium, special recipes or growth factors. But if you see here, they don't have, if you do an immunofluorescence trying to show the myosins, that are proteins that are only in the muscle fibers, they don't have any. So these cells, they grow fast, they're cheap to grow, but they don't really give you the same nutritional value and taste that you could have from a muscle tissue, so meaning close to a real piece of meat. So we did prototypes like many other companies did. We did some chicken nuggets that purposely we mixed with some 50-50 with plant proteins, or 50-50 with conventional chicken meat, because we wanted to show that the model at the moment can be flexible. The more the technology will develop, and we will be able to grow in a larger scale the cells. But until then, we can use a mix. So we start to make hybrid products that are still okay, and we can start already to minimize, or to have less need of these massive farms where they keep the animals in horrible conditions. So that's already one step forward. We also made a liver pate from pig stem cells, and then we drove them to differentiate specifically in liver cells. And this actually was 100% cells plus other components to keep everything together. That was just to show the flexibility of the system. So culture meat doesn't have to be only a steak or a burger, but in many cultures, in many countries, we liver with other organs, so we could actually grow any cell types that they can be used as food in the future. But then I wanted to do something that's I did in the lab. Well, actually in the kitchen, not really in the lab. So I want to do a comparison, because that's one thing that everybody's asking. Okay, how this a mass of cells taste? So we did like a blind a test, just putting in a pan a little piece of chicken breast and a little piece of concentrated cells, concentrated myotubes that we grew previously. We put it in a pan, just using a little bit of butter, just to, not to let them stick and burn on the surface of the pan, but then just to cook them and without sticking. So, and I have to tell you that they were tasting the same. The texture wasn't there, of course. The texture of a chicken breast, it's different. Muscle tissues it's a complex thing. There are not only the muscle fibers, but all muscle fibers are wrapped in extracellular matrix components, and then a fibers is wrapped, and then a group of fibers is wrapped again, and then other groups of fibers are wrapped and wrapped continuously. So that's what makes the tissue hard and functional, so for the contraction that needs to do. So in the lab you cannot really do that, but still the texture wasn't there, but the taste was, to me, was really identical. It's true, our brain sometimes it acts on behalf of our tongue and our sense of taste, but it looks really good to me. So, but anyway, so where are we now with the culture meats? Okay, as you probably know, or you don't know, culture meat it's just still in the labs, in R&D, mostly in research and development in the companies. There is one single product that is out on the market since last year, and it's from an American company called Eat Just, but it's been sold in Singapore. So they opened a little subsidiary company in Singapore, and they sell it there under the name The Good Meat, only to a few restaurants of our chain. I don't remember the chain. So, but that's the product you see on the left photo. On the right photo is actually the hand of a colleague of mine that she was in Singapore as she tasted and sent some photographs to me. So this was a big thing for the entire industry, because, you know, from something that you grow in the lab, but in numbers that are not really optimal for making products, to having a real thing that you can eat, it was a very good step forward, because some people, they started to doubt that cultured meat will never happen because it's too expensive and too hard to grow the numbers that are needed to make even a few products. So actually, the last, I didn't add it here, the last couple of days, another American company has been approved here by the FDA. The name is, the company's Upside Food. They changed the name recently. Before they were known as Memphis Meat. So they passed the first step of regulation. They got regulated by FDA, but they still have to go through the USDA, because it looks funny maybe, but because the cells are coming from animals, so the US Department of Agriculture is involved in the regulation of the food. So they still need the USDA to approve the use, and they also need to make sure that they can make something, you know, a substantial amount of them, but still, it's another step forward. So in fact, the news went all over the world, because, you know, cultured meat is not anymore just a Frankenstein study in the lab, but it's coming out eventually in the supermarkets or in restaurants to start. There are some little problems with that. So with such a fast delivery of the product. So for instance, you see, Just, it's one of the companies that took the famous shortcut that I mentioned earlier. So those sort of chicken nuggets that you are seeing here, they're not actually made of chicken muscle, but are made of chicken fibroblasts, immortalized chicken fibroblasts. So a cell that it's present all over our body, but mostly under our skin. So there are cells that are in connective tissue. They don't really have a specific function, rather than help the structure of the tissue. So, but they don't really have the nutritional values and anything related to meat. But so that's what they make now. So why I'm insisting on that? It's because you know, cultured meat, if we want to in the future give product to consumers, offer another alternative that is not plant-based or mycelium-based meat, to avoid, you know, slaughtering on animals and so on and so forth, we really need to offer a product that is closer to what is real meat. So growing fibroblasts, just to be quick and show that this industry exists, has good but also bad effects, in my view, of course. So I think I'm running out of my time. So I will just summarize what is happening now. So the cultured meat will be a valid alternative of conventional meat. And differently from plant-based or vegan meat, whatever we want to call it, will have the same nutritional values of conventional meat, the same taste, and in the future, when technology advances, the same texture, but naturally, without having to be artificially flavored, like, you know, the mycelium and the plant-based, they add flavoring and everything to make them taste something that resemble meat. So, and it will become definitely part of our diet in the future. But of course, there are challenges, roadblocks that needs to be addressed. And the first one is to get the relevant source of cells, so cells that they can able to proliferate enough to be grown in massive bioreactors. But at the same time, the cost has to go down dramatically, because we cannot make burger, and not at $325,000, but not even a $3,500. We have to make something with a price that is similar to a burger that you would buy to. I'm not saying to a fast food chain, even from a premier burger place, but still has similar price. And then the process has to be efficient. So how do we do that? As I mentioned earlier, companies are jumping in to help the entire industry. So the growth factors, media component price will go down, and it's already one big part of the problem. But also, in addition, you can actually decide, some companies can decide to make their own media component in-house, because it's not a process that's very expensive. And actually, once that you pay for the initial components to make it, then you don't spend money any longer. But it's the production efficiency that will be very important. So we will have to have ad hoc bioreactors that will be developed only for the culture meat, and will have to be flexible to grow first the proliferating cells, but also to get the differentiating cells and to make the assembly of the myocytes into myotubes efficiently, and maybe even organized to really make a piece of muscle tissues. And the medium can go lower as you want in terms of money, but has to be also the use optimized. So as to
Thank you
but
very much for your
I
very interesting more we are expecting. We are going to have, I think, a few questions. I will start with one because I'm very curious.
Yes.
I'm thinking that, of course, you produce meat in clean rooms, right?
In clean,
Clean rooms, yes.
yes, of course, that's fundamental. So we must.
Are you subjected to the same FDA regulation and control? So the same limits that when you produce stem cells that need to be transplanted to a patient? I mean, just curious.
That is correct. So, well, it goes through a different channel because it's something new. That's why it took also years to build up the regulatory work. But it's the same. It's a considered novel food. So, but it has to go through all the safety requirements for a food that would be already out. So, yes, it will go through similar steps, like you said, a cell therapy when you get cells that has to grow clean to then inject them back to the patient. So it will be very similar. But actually, the clean, because initially culture meat was called clean meat for a reason, because massive farming is also producing a lot of problem. Especially here in the US, we have every week or two we have some recall of tons and tons of pound of meat because of possible contamination. So culture meat, if it will be well done, it will also minimize, almost eliminate this problem of possible contaminants during the process.
Question. You were showing us the difference between your company and the competitors, right? How for us, for a generic public like us, when we go to a grocery store and we need to read the labels behind, how we can compare one product to another?
Okay, yes. Well, you will have to wait for a few years when you will have different culture meat products on the supermarket. Remember that what is out now, meaning the plant-based, it's something that is nothing to do with culture meat. It's another protein alternatives, but it's a different business. So you will have to wait for a while to get many culture meat companies out there. But then I hope that because of the labeling from the FDA and the USDA, then you will know who is actually growing and offering you a real alternative to meat, growing muscles, organized muscle, myofibers, so meaning like a real chunk of meat, and maybe adding even fat to really mimicking even better a steak or a burger, so with a fat component. And then you will see, at the same time, you will see other companies that will offer only cells of unknown origin or not very well specified to as a product. So then once that you have those labels, I hope that the labels will be clear enough, because the authorities will ask to be clear, then you will have an easy choice on what you're gonna buy at the supermarket.
Thank you. We have additional questions.
So I got three questions. The first one is, could you draw any parallels between GMO foods and cultured meats? The second one is, does the moral...
Okay, let's start with the first one. So let's do one at a time. So GMO, it's another story, and some actually companies, they use a sort of GMO technology. So what they do, instead of growing muscles, they from stem cell, they induce muscle differentiation from cells that are not muscle cells, but just by putting some important genes that are relevant during development to make the muscle tissue, and then to turn on this gene. So whatever cells they had, fibroblasts or whatever, they turn into muscle because of this GMO process, and then they grow the muscle at the last stage of the process. But GMO, it's a different, I would say in the culture meat, it's more a problem of individuals, meaning if you are accept that or not, since you are not anyway doing anything to the animal. So it's not that you are modifying an organism, an entire animal in like a Frankenstein and try to do it, but you only work a little bit on the cells to improve the process. I personally don't have anything against that. We don't use it. We don't need, because we know how to grow muscle. But in that case, I wouldn't see it as a problem. Second question.
So does the moral argument from the vegan community still stand in this case, or what is the major pushback that you've received?
Well, then you have to ask to a vegan person. I'm not, so I cannot give you an answer. Well, it depends. Many people decided not to eat meat anymore, but also for a variety of different reasons. Some because they think that eating meat is unhealthy, or others because of the animals, others because who knows. So it's too broad, the reasons why I don't eat. It's a good question, because it came out a little bit, but in some debates, previous debate in the cultured meat space. So I don't know if probably the real hardcore vegan, I would call them, would probably don't accept this. I don't know. I cannot give the answer again, because I'm not vegan and not even a vegetarian. So, but to me, if you don't touch the animals, or only get a couple of biopsies just to grow the stem cells, so just a poking that they probably don't even feel, I think you're saving the animals, so you're doing something good. So why not using their cells, to make food? So I personally, I don't see this problem. But again, I'm not vegan, so I cannot give an answer for them.
Okay, thank you so much again, Dr. Barberi. And now, let me introduce our second speaker, Professor Dennis Bier. Professor Bier is a professor of pediatrics and director of USDA Children's Nutrition Research Center at Baylor College of Medicine. He has served as editor of the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, editor of Pediatric Research, and associate editor of the Annual Review of Nutrition. Additionally, Dr. Bier was chairman of the Food and Nutrition Board of the National Research Council and National Academies of Science. He served as a president of the American Society for Nutrition, and the list goes on and on. He also has been a counselor of the American Pediatric Society, served in the FDA Pediatric Advisory Committee, and many others. Today, Professor Bier will explain us how nutrition science has evolved through the years and enhance its goal for a long life health prevention. Today, the attention on this field is high and is focused into nutrition intake and dietary patterns of food intake. So thank you, Dr. Bier, and welcome.
Okay, thanks. Can everybody hear me? Okay, so originally I thought I was kind of the odd man out in the three speakers because I was talking about health and the speakers before me and after me were talking about sustainability and things, and I am going to focus my talk on the health benefits of the Mediterranean diet. But the fact is, a great activity today in the whole field of Mediterranean diet is the fact that it is a sustainable source of, future nutritional health. So I'm not going to spend time on that, but it does turn out to be a bridge between the first two speakers. So can I get in? Are you going to sit here or are you? Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is the media. So every day you read in the paper that something about some nutritional thing changes. So I think the public has an impression that nutrition changes from day to day, and this is absolutely wrong. The fundamental principles of nutrition have been around for well over 150 years. And here we have, for example, some recommendations that a physician made to Civil War soldiers going off into fight in the Civil War. And they deal with having a diet that's animal and vegetable sources. You need a variety of foods, prefer fresh fruits, etc. Okay. In 1959, Ansel Keys, 1 year before he wrote the paper that named the Mediterranean diet, made these recommendations, okay? Good diets don't depend on drugs, limit saturated fats, salt, and refined sugars, favor fresh vegetables and fruit, get plenty of exercise, and don't get fat. He also said at the end, by the way, don't worry, something like trust your physicians and don't worry. Well, that's the one I kind of disagree with, frankly, but the rest of them are all, no different today than they are in the 2020 dietary guidelines for Americans. So the fundamental, facts, the fundamental things that nutritionists believe haven't changed in well over 100 years. So let's go back to the period about 1959, 1960, when the term Mediterranean diet came into the literature. And in the mid-20th century, first of all the essential nutrients had been identified. We don't have any new ones. We have a variety of hypotheses about some nutrients, but fundamentally, we've known all the essential nutrients for 60 or 70 years. And at that time, the focus of nutrition was on assuring essential nutrient adequacy. So the scientists were focused on this reductionist experimental approach, which is you take people, you put them in a confined place, you test a specific nutrient like zinc against, adequacy of zinc functions, all right? And so you're reducing your experiment to some individual nutrient and looking at the outcome. Now, I think you need to know that almost all of these were small groups of predominantly white graduate students who got paid money to participate in this, or sometimes prisoners, which we can't use anymore. And they were studied under controlled conditions, but there were little groups of people, usually young adults, okay? And you can imagine then when committees get together to take those little pieces of information and convert it to the 330 Americans of multicultural diversity, that you need to make a whole bunch of adjustments. So the nutritionists call these things like adjustments, and the public calls it something like fudge factors, right? You make a variety of assumptions and you correct 16 graduate students at Cornell University into 330 million Americans. Now, despite that, a number of committees now have met on doing just this, really over a dozen intervals. And whereas they focus on putting numbers to like 2 or 3 decimal places, that's stretching it a bit. But the fact is, we have pretty good working values for nutrient adequacy. So you may read the, the dietary recommendations from the National Academy, and it may say the value for nutrient X is 17 milligrams a day. Well, it could be 12 and it could be 20, but somewhere in that ballpark we are able to determine these, and we know they work because every society that I'm aware of in which there's been adequate food that can supply these kind of numbers has very little real nutrient deficiency. Okay, so out of those numbers, we've gotten first what used to be called the recommended dietary allowances, which ended in 1989 and became dietary reference intakes. And they are focused on nutrients, zinc and, calcium and, whatever, okay? And they're designed to ensure the nutrient adequacy of the population. So what that means is that most people are adequate at lower numbers than that. So those values are meant to ensure the adequacy of 97.5% of the people. Well, means that an awful lot of people are perfectly adequate below that. And so when the newspaper tells you that 20% of Americans don't get enough vitamin E, some fraction of Americans are perfectly fine without that. So these numbers are meant to make you feel bad and go out and do something about it that you don't need to do. And remember, these are done by experimental studies in which people are put on deficient diets and then go to sufficient diets. So the endpoints are measurable and they represent 100% of the people who are studied. You go from insufficient to sufficient, okay? Now, somewhere after about the mid-20th century, okay, the focus changed and nutrient adequacy was no longer the issue in the developed world like this country. So you read all of the time about how people don't meet nutrient needs, and we do have a small background of iron deficiency, particularly in menstruating women. We have an issue of enough calcium for bone health, but most of these other things, potential nutrient deficiencies, only occur in sick people. They're not found in the general population as a rule. Okay, and the focus now has been, or since then, has been not on adequacy, but on reduction, whether those nutrients can reduce chronic disease risk. So there's been a real change in what nutrition is looking at. And the difference, there's a big fundamental difference between direct measurements, where everybody responds, to indirect calculations of risk to which some people respond and some don't. So the risk reduction versus correction of a deficiency. And not many people appreciate this, but these are profoundly different ways of trying to look at the population. Okay, so then everybody says, well, we only do what the science says, okay? Now, nobody ever claims they don't do what the science says. It's a particularly useless designation because no scientist, scientific group, no governments ever get up and say, we're making recommendations based on absolutely no data. I don't know what that is. Okay. So the point is, just saying we're going to follow the science isn't terribly helpful. Recommendations from many of these committees disagree. So how do you know what to do? And there is a way to feel better about knowing what to do. And it's two very well established scientific principles. One is the scientific method, which has been around, and iterated over several hundred years, where you take a specific question, you design an experiment to answer that question, and you keep doing that so you can have predictability, and eventually you know the sun, the Earth revolves around the sun doesn't revolve around the Earth. So you get to a predictability. But then you have a whole body of scientific information, and how do you put it together? And you put it together according to a hierarchy of the quality of evidence that's also well established throughout science. Now, in different parts of science, and even in biology, some of these things in this pyramid are called slightly different terms, but they're fundamentally the same. And I want you to, a very important thing to remember is expert opinion, like mine, is at the bottom. It's not the highest level of evidence, it's the lowest level of evidence. It's a subjective view of somebody who's an expert, but that's not the same as the evidence that's on the table. And we move up in different kinds of evidence to the vast bulk of evidence in nutrition studies are cohort studies where you follow 100,000 people for 20 years and see what happens, basically, okay? And these, when well done, are really good. I mean, they're important, okay? But you have to remember a few things, and the major one is no matter how well they're done, they can't prove causality. What they prove is there's an association between eating pepperoni pizzas and, whatever happens later. But they don't prove causality. Now, the people who do them say, we're so good at this that it's really pretty much the same as causal. But the fact is they can't prove causality. Now, that's been known since the classical era of, Greece and Rome. That the fallacy in that, all right? Now, the next level up, where you do carefully controlled randomized studies, we are lucky enough to have some in nutrition, but they're very hard to do. And that's the problem in nutrition, is that it's not that we don't know the principles, it's that it's really hard to do studies to get people to change diets for 20 years and have, and to sustain those diets, blah, blah, blah. So it's not that we don't know what to do, it's just that it's very difficult to do, okay? So we end up here, kind of in the middle, where we have a lot of supportive data, but we don't necessarily have proof. Okay, so what's the problem? Here's Donald Rumsfeld. I'm not sure I'm allowed to quote Donald Rumsfeld at Rice University. Is that allowed here? I mean, maybe it's not. But, Rumsfeld said there are known knowns, things that we know. Well, that's where we are most of the time. We have a bunch of stuff we know. Then there are known unknowns, which are things that we know we don't know. And boy, there are a hell of a lot of those. And then there are the unknown unknowns, where we don't even know we don't know it, okay? Now, the nutritionists, or old scientists, but nutritional cohort studies for years have been correcting for a number of the things that we know are associated with what we're measuring, like socioeconomic class, education, blah, blah, blah. But what has happened in the last, decade or so, we have, through the kind of supercomputing that's available today, we have all of this huge amount of big data. And big data has shown us that the traditional approaches to correcting 5 things and 12 things is just inadequate, because it's 60 things and 120 things that move with each other that make it very difficult to associate one nutrient or one piece of food with some outcome 20 or 30 years later. No one yet knows how to deal with that, all right? I mean, there are a lot of good people working with it, but we really don't know how to deal with it. So here's an example, and I don't want you to read this, but around the outside here, well, you can't read it, I can hardly read it. Around the outside are some of the variables that exist in the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, the National Nutrition Database, okay? And what is seen from this with these lines are the ones that are all connected to each other. So when one changes, the other one changes to some degree, a lot or a little. And what we know is that single individual nutrients in NHANES can be connected to, as I said a few minutes ago, 60 different things. And you know that, yourselves, in the sense that you know that the people who buy food at Central Market are not the same people who buy food at, Fiesta. There's a bunch of other things that they do in their lives that are connected to their food habits. Okay? And the same is true with dietary patterns. Again, forget all the numbers here. All you need to do is look at the colors. So these are different kinds of dietary patterns, and the magnitude of the peaks are related to how much of that stuff is in a person's diet. And what we see is that there are very different patterns. And you know this because you have a certain series of patterns that you eat at home, right? And they recur over time, all right? But they're very different than somebody else's. And there are people who have established groups of macronutrients and foods that they consume on a regular basis, and there are these very different patterns. So, where does that get us? Well, what that gets us is to a real change in how we look at what people eat. Okay, so you need reductionism to determine causal pathways. Now, I'm a reductionist guy. It's what I've done all my life. All right, and I'm telling you that doesn't answer these questions anymore. It's really good. I mean, I really like it. But people don't eat nutrients, they eat foods. And they eat foods in very complicated dietary patterns. And the functions at this higher biological level of you eating in your local society, global society, whatever, what foods are available to you, those kind of questions can't be answered by reductionist studies of one nutrient in a college, clinical unit, right? So we've moved to what John Tukey, who's one of the world's famous statisticians, who says sometimes, or often, the approximate answer to the right question is preferable to the precise answer to the wrong question. So we have a lot of extrapolating the wrong questions from reductionist studies to dietary patterns and the environment. So we're moving towards other approaches, and the approach to a solution came about starting with, Ansel Keys 60 years ago to look at societal dietary patterns. So these are, now very well established. Some are due to long historic patterns, like the Mediterranean diet and like traditional Asian diets, for example, that have been going on for centuries, really. Okay. And then we have what I would call children of the Mediterranean diet. So in Nordic countries, we have the same principles of the Mediterranean diet that are put in operation with other local foods that are in these Nordic countries, and with a few significant differences. So the Mediterranean diet, of course, is loaded with olive oil, and the Nordic countries don't do much olive oil, so they have canola oil. They have variants, but fundamentally these are, based on traditional foods. Then you have human imitations like the DASH diet, which was constructed from the principles of the Mediterranean diet to use in the treatment of hypertension, and what's called the MIND diet, which is actually partially a Mediterranean diet and partially another one that's part of that acronym, and I don't remember what it is. But these are human variants, which are really based on the Mediterranean diet. The principles are all the same there, okay? And the important thing about the Mediterranean diet, I think, is shown on this slide. And I took off the web from old ways, so I apologize, everybody. But what you want to look at here is, the first thing is, the Mediterranean diet is all about stuff you should eat. It's not focused on what you shouldn't eat. Virtually the entire period is food you should eat. Okay. Secondly, these are all foods you can buy in a supermarket. We're not talking about GMO foods. We're not talking about organic food. These are regular old foods. So, there's nothing secret about this diet. I mean, that's one of the reasons why it's so popular. You can walk in and pick out a remarkable amount of foods without any special education, really, And it's very heavily weighted towards plant products, which almost every diet variant of this is, okay? And it eventually, gets a little less of this, a little less of that, and ultimately meat and some sweets and things are at the top of the diet. Again, they're not eliminated, they're just reduced in quantity and frequency compared to the other foods. And these foods are chosen, or they're all in this diet, because they have bioactive nature. So we have the omega-3 fatty acids, which have biological effects. We have all kinds of biological effects of alcohol and olive oil. And so there's a huge literature on these chemicals that are parts of these foods and why they're there and why they contribute to a healthy diet. And this is another way of showing that. For example, again, these are the components of the Mediterranean diet, and different experiments over decades now have shown that they all have these kind of effects, and and the summation of those kind of effects is to reduce cardiovascular disease. So that's olive oil. I'm going to skip it for a minute. Okay, so here's another slide. And in this slide, don't look at any of the numbers. It's only the colors that matter, okay? So green is good. Green means positive benefit with some, real supportive effects. And dark green means even more positive benefit with even better scientific support. So if we look at, here's Atkins diet, DASH, Ornish diet, blah, blah, blah. They were all pretty good for weight loss, and the reason for that is when you move to a primarily fruit and vegetable-based diet, you almost always reduce your energy intake, and that leads to weight loss. So they're all, under controlled circumstances, they're all pretty good there. But if we look at the Mediterranean diet, it has significantly known benefits on blood pressure, on lipoproteins, and the summation is that of all of the potential effects, and I'll show you in a minute, that the Mediterranean diet has a vast body of data about cardiovascular benefit. All right? Okay, including the results, for example, of this study. One study, the PREDIMED study, which was conducted in Spain. And look, this is the incidence of the cardiovascular endpoints, which included myocardial infarction, stroke, myocardial death. And here's the control, the lowest quintile, the people who had the least Mediterranean diet, so to speak. And this is the ones who had the most. And here you see basically a 50% reduction in cardiovascular risk over time. And the literature is full of these studies. And I'm going to show you briefly a number of studies, but to do so, I want to have a brief slide on the meaning of a forest plot. This particular way of representing data has now become so commonplace in the medical literature that you need to understand it. It's a way of representing, putting a bunch of studies together, okay, in a so-called meta-analysis, and showing whether the summation of the data from different studies, what does that tell us? So in a forest plot, there's always a line of identity, okay? And you're comparing some kind of a treatment, which could be a drug, or in this case, the Mediterranean diet, to the usual condition, whatever that is, okay? Each individual study is represented by a symbol, usually a square or a circle, okay? And the confidence in that study is represented by this horizontal line, and the size of the study is represented by the size of the box or the circle. So this study here had probably twice as many people as that study. And if the horizontal line, the confidence, crosses the identity line, that means that this is not significant. So whereas there was a big reduction in this particular study, it wasn't significant because it had a wide range of variation. Whereas in this study, it was, okay, there was a reduction of, 50% or whatever, and it was highly significant, right? And then at the end, when they add all the studies up, there's usually a triangle at the bottom, and when the triangle is crossing the line of identity, it's not significant, and if it's not, it is, okay? All right, so let's look at risk reduction estimates for Mediterranean diet and fruit and vegetable diets. They're very highly significant in comparing different kinds of foods like omega-3 fatty acids against more traditional things like aspirin, fibrates, clofebrate, and things of that sort, which these were some reductions, but they're all pretty much not significant. Okay? So fruit and vegetable diets are generally ones in which one can show risk reduction, or fruit and vegetable-based diets. Now here are results of the Mediterranean diet and various chronic diseases. And here you have overall mortality, so you're still going to die, basically. That's the bad news. Okay, you're still going to die. And frankly, there's a lot of debate about whether or not the Mediterranean diet can improve lifespan. That's an unknown. Okay? But if one looks at things like cardiovascular mortality, incidence of stroke, certain kinds of composite cardiovascular functions like infarction plus stroke, whatever, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, etc. All of these endpoints are significantly improved by the Mediterranean diet. And remember, in this study here, these are the number of studies involved in these points, and these are the number of individuals. There were thousands of individuals, and this is just one representative of that meta-analysis. Here's another one in cancer. This is the result of something like combining 17 studies of 3.2 million people. So it's a lot of numbers, okay? And again, here we have reductions, borderline reductions in things like bladder cancer, et cetera, but very significant reductions in GI cancers, et cetera. So this is not as strong. The data on cancers is not as strong as the data on cardiovascular disease, but it's significant in most cases. And I guess the bad news is with regard to cognitive function, the numbers are much less hard. Okay, so here are a variety of studies on cognitive function, and you notice most of them show little, change in the favor of Mediterranean diet and have confidence intervals crossing 1. So the net effect with regard to cognitive functions is I don't know, or at least I don't remember. Okay, so we don't have a real answer there, and someday we may, but we don't have the same kind of strength of evidence as we do for cardiovascular disease. So, in summary, so you can read the dietary guidelines for America. It's like 284 pages long or something like that. Here's my dietary guidelines, one slide. Number 1, choose your parents carefully. Now, the fact is, the genes account for half of whatever happens to you. So, we haven't learned quite how to do this yet, but once you can, pick your parents, okay? And then, as I showed you on that one slide of the Mediterranean diet pyramid, pay more attention to what you should eat than what you shouldn't eat. I mean, a vast fraction of nutrition recommendations deal with things you shouldn't do, okay? And the basic fact is you need to focus on what you should do. And one thing you should do is eat a very wide variety of primarily plant-based foods. And don't worry about numbers, because frankly, nutrition doesn't know if 17 is different than 12. The field doesn't know that, okay? And remember, the body doesn't think around the 24-hour clock. Those things that you should eat every day is based on humans and what they know about days. It has nothing to do with the biology here, pretty much. So don't worry about that. If you eat this wide variety of primary plant-based foods, what's the consequence? You will almost certainly consume all the necessary essential nutrients. Yeah, it's a guarantee, fundamentally. You will achieve a dietary pattern that's consistent with the Mediterranean diet, or if you happen to be an Asian family, or if you happen to live in Norway, it'll be more consistent with those offspring of the Mediterranean diet, but the principles will be the same. Okay? And you'll consume a health-promoting diet within the limits of nutritional knowledge. Now, nutritionists don't want to admit that, because they like to tell you what the answer is. The answer is 42, whatever, or something. But you know, within the noise of all of our knowledge in putting together these diets, if you really consume a wide variety of plant-based foods, you will be, you know, you will almost certainly fall within those limits. And then finally, a few other things, like watch your weight. Okay, obesity contributes more to poor health than all the other things pretty much combined. Right? And think about it, you don't need any special instruments. All you need is a scale or a mirror. Right? You don't need any. They are the most precise instruments we have in biology. Right? Okay, remain active, whatever that kind of activity it is, and importantly, and everybody I think in this audience would know that, don't smoke. I mean, smoking has a, you know, the nutritional risk changes are on the order of 2 or 3 maybe. Okay, smoking risk reductions are on the order of 30 or 50 or 60. So we're not even in the same ballpark here. All right. So that's my dietary guidelines 101. All right, and I'll take questions.
First question is, do we believe, or do you believe, do we have any evidence that carbohydrates are pro-inflammatory molecules? Since the Mediterranean diet is rich in carbohydrates. Second question is, one of the diets is very in fashion now, is the intermittent fasting. One of the reasons that people have been trying to promote this diet is because it is claimed that through fasting there is increasing the ketones in the body that exert an anti-inflammatory action, and so they would decrease chronic inflammation, degenerative joint disease, everything. Do you have an opinion on these two subjects?
So the first about carbohydrates, I have actually given talks that I've labeled the last pediatrician who's not afraid of sugar. And the reason for that is, in my estimation, the data on the harms of carbohydrate and sugar intake are not as strong as certain advocates of those positions would like to believe. So I think in the case of the Mediterranean diet, we have vast bodies of evidence that that dietary pattern is associated with risk reduction, irrespective of what the carbohydrate content. The second about anti-inflammatory agents. A great fraction of the Mediterranean diet is constructed on its effects on anti-inflammatory or antioxidative agents. And, you know, there were periods of time in biology when different kinds of hypothetical themes take over the field. So right now we have anti-inflammation and antioxidation, and yes, there's a lot of data for those things. But you know, I mean, it's not a one hypothesis that solves all the problems, frankly. I mean, and I think you just have to be, you have to take data over hypotheses. You know, hypotheses are great until they're tested. And once they're tested and you have data, then you need to use the answers you have. And we here, for this particular diet, we have a lot of answers. And admittedly, you know, as I said earlier, these answers are based on observational data. So they can't, in many cases, prove cause and effect. But after 6 decades and hundreds, well, millions of people, plus, you know, God only knows how many different approaches to studying this, I think we can feel reasonably confident that we have one approach that works.
Thank you.
Now we have our last speaker. Professor Calabrese is assistant professor at Texas A&M, Biological and Agricultural Engineering Department. where he leads a research group focusing in hydrology and ecosystem sustainability. He will talk today about the importance of food security and new climate-smart agricultural practice.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation. Honestly, I thought I was the elephant in the room today because we've been talking about food, cultured meat, diet, and so as you can see, I'm an engineer. So you may be wondering, what is an engineer doing here, talking about Italian cuisine? Well, the fact is that whatever food we're eating today, traditionally, it comes from a very complex food chain that starts in some agricultural land where we're using either to grow crops or to offer pasture. And to grow enough food for everyone, and the population is increasing, we need to make sure that that agricultural land has all the conditions for crops to grow in the amount that we want. Or the same, we want to have enough land for pasture. And that is an engineering problem. So we want to create optimal, ideal conditions for growth. So let's start with something that we are all familiar with. I'm sure that all of us have some little small plants, maybe one or more in our house, right? And we want our plants to be happy, right? We know that they need sunlight, and we also know that they need water, right? So we read the instructions and we know how frequently, for example, we need to provide water, and we do it. And we're very happy to see the plant grow. Unfortunately, at least in my experience, I follow the instruction, but still, sometimes these plants manage to die. I don't know, maybe that happened to you as well. The fact is that, similar to our body, plants also need a bunch of nutrients. And they take those nutrients from the soil. That means that water is not enough. We need to have either a good soil from the beginning, but also we need to be able to provide these nutrients in the right amount. So growing a plant, even in our home, is not that easy. When we translate to the large number of agricultural lands, to the extent of agricultural lands that we have globally, that's a natural resources management problem. We need to make sure that our agricultural lands have the right amount of water at the right time, and they have the right amount of nutrients at the right time and the right dose. And as we can see here, we use, of course, irrigation, right, in our agricultural lands. And in fact, because of irrigation, 60% or more of the fresh water that we take from rivers, from groundwater, all of that water goes into agricultural lands. It's not water that we are drinking. This is what consumes most of the water that we take from the environment. But we also need to fertilize our lands. And this is a picture here. I know that there are some blogs where I can take pictures for free, so I don't worry about that. So this is an example of an agricultural field where with some machineries we are able to, of course, fertilize the land. And if you're not familiar with it, in the 1950s, 60s, those decades were called, let me move the, so that period was called the Green Revolution. That is really when we learned how to irrigate and fertilize, and we learned how to do that. And there was a big push to expand irrigation fertilization globally, and that led to a very large increase in agricultural production. And that was a good thing, especially for developing countries, because they could produce much more. In some places, the agricultural production doubled thanks to that. Unfortunately, now we know that it's not all good news, because agricultural practices, they can also be a stressor for the environment. So, using too much water, for example. We need to take a lot of water from our streams or from our groundwater, so we affect the environment. And the same with fertilizers. They change the water quality, so the quality of our water, the quality of our soils, and so forth. And that is not good news. I want to show you an example from the US. This picture here is actually from the 1850s, was modified, of course, so that we could see nice in colors. And that place is agricultural land in South Carolina. That county is Calhoun County. And I'm talking about this example because I've been there, not in the 1850s, of course. I've been there now, and we've been studying this place for a long time. This land was used for intense agricultural production of cotton. Cotton plantations are beautiful, but they also require a lot of water and fertilizers. And what happened from the 1850 to the 1950, the land became from a beautiful cotton plantation to what you see here. Almost unbelievable, right? You couldn't say that this is the same place. It's actually the same place. So intense agricultural production can lead to land degradation. Land degradation means really like losing our soils, and that leads to erosion, and essentially here you cannot grow anything. And people have to abandon these lands, and of course, couldn't be used for agriculture anymore. So at that time, the U.S. Forest Service planted trees to see what happens. Can we recover these lands if we plant trees? And that's why we study this place a lot, because Duke University, with a project funded by the National Science Foundation, established an observatory. I'm somewhere in this photo, I don't remember where. But here we studied whether by planting trees, we could go from this degraded land back to the land, the original land. And the bad news is that it seems that we really can't. So we recovered a little bit our soils, but we really can't go back to the original healthy soils that we had. And this is not only a problem in South Carolina, it's really a global problem. As you can see from this map, that's from 2021, land degradation affects now virtually everywhere. You can see here in the US, the southeast, that's where the lagoon is, but the south is pretty much affected, South California, and really there is a little bit of land degradation everywhere. This is a real problem because there are lands that were used for agriculture and we no longer can use those lands. But at the same time, the population globally is growing, food demand is growing, and so this is a very important limitation for us. And so at that time, once we figured that agricultural practices are not, they can be an important stressor for the environment, there was a big push for sustainable agriculture, the concept of sustainability. This was decades ago, and unfortunately the approach was a little bit reactive. After we experienced the effects of intense agriculture, we said, okay, maybe we can change something to make agriculture more sustainable. The response at that time was something called conservation agriculture, which means maybe we can come up with practices that are less intensive, and maybe that leads to using less water, maybe less fertilizers, less mechanical disturbance of the land, and all of that may lead to really prevent land degradation. Now, the fact is that I think we always have this kind of reactive approach. We never do things to prevent, we always respond to things. And we didn't even extend the use of conservation practices globally, that we are starting to face new problems, which is climate change. And so that really changes the picture, the context completely. So conservation agriculture is no longer enough, because now we also have problems of water scarcity in the first place. And this is an example of what the Mississippi River looked like a few days ago. This is from 2 days ago. We have a higher temperature, and that's not always good for our plants. Same like us, if it's too hot, we don't like it. That's the same for plants. They have an optimal temperature for growth, and if the temperature increases too much, that's not good for them. And we also have extreme events. That's the case here, again, a few weeks ago from Pakistan flood. We have really extensive flooding that is disrupting not only urban areas, but also all the agricultural lands. So when you have events like this, your entire food production system collapses. And these things are happening. And as a result of this, the entire socioeconomic system is becoming more susceptible. Okay? We are experiencing firsthand some inflation, and some of it is caused by problems in the food supply chain too. So what's water scarcity? Water scarcity just means that the way rainfall is coming is changing. So the frequency of rainfall changes, how much rainfall we get every year, and essentially, again, the entire globe is experiencing some level of water scarcity. And again, because agriculture consumes about 60% of fresh water, a little percentage of water scarcity can be disruptive for agriculture, just because agriculture needs so much. And you can see everywhere in the tropical and temperate regions, we have water scarcity. Only the really higher latitudes are safe right now, at least right now. Okay, so, but these are not only things that we can see in a map, but these problems are real. And if you were here this summer in Texas, you knew that we experienced an exceptional drought, at least that's how the news called it. But you can see here that, again, here the red color is bad, and really most of Texas was under extreme drought or exceptional drought conditions. What this means is that our rivers are dry, groundwater levels are low, and we don't really have water to sustain our regular activities. We had the same problem in Europe. You may have heard the news there as well, especially Central Europe and Eastern Europe. They had one of the most droughts in history. And in the summer, and what is funny is that typically it's Southern Europe that experiences water scarcity in the summer. But this summer in particular was the opposite. So Northern Europe experienced drought, while the southern Italy and Greece, they were okay. So that's actually a photo of the Po River this summer, and I'm sure many of you have seen it. It was incredible. So it's historical low levels. It's also getting hotter. I don't know if you like the heat in the summer, but this summer in Texas was terrible. Some places, especially, I know College Station, this is 1 hour northwest from here, and we had the record for continuous days with temperature above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. We had essentially 2 months or so where every day it was continuously above 100. And I'm from southern Italy as well, from Palermo, so I thought that was hot. But here, it's a completely different level. It's like another level of hot. So I don't really like it. And unfortunately, you can see, I think it's from, for Austin, and this is the number of days during the year with temperature above 100 degrees. And you can see, especially from the year 2000, maybe you cannot see, but this is year 2000, this is 2021. You can see the trend, right? So every year we've been seeing more and more days with temperatures above 100 degrees. That's really a problem for agriculture, again, because not all crops like these temperatures. Okay. Same problem in Europe, and you might have seen, especially it was very weird to see people in England having 40 or higher degrees Celsius, and they don't have any sea anymore. It's not like here. So that was a really catastrophic for them and also for their agriculture. Oops. Okay. So we've been experiencing all these problems in agriculture, but the thing is that agriculture actually contributed to some of those. Because of the extent of the agricultural land and our practices, we now know that agriculture actually contributes to climate change. This is a graph where we show over the years the amount of greenhouse gas that are emitted. And what you need to see here is that there is some level of emissions from what they call here land use change. What that means is all those lands that are forests, we cut the forest to turn it into an agricultural land, and that leads to a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. This is right now is a critical problem in Brazil, where the Amazon forest has been burned to create new agricultural lands, and that leads a lot to greenhouse gas emissions, and that's a problem. And typically, the contribution every year has been of about 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. So, I'll be very quick, I promise. So what happens with climate change is that the concept of sustainability is not enough. Because when we talk about sustainability, we've been focusing on the environment in the sense that we want to limit the impact that we have on the environment. But the problem now is that not only we need to limit the impact on the environment, we also need to adapt. So the way we do in our way of doing agriculture, we need to adapt to those temperatures. We need to adapt to use less water. If we have a drought, somehow we need to deal with that. In addition to that, we need to mitigate, because we know that agriculture contributes to the climate problem. So we need to find ways for agriculture to help mitigate climate change. And that led to a new concept, which is called climate smart agriculture. And climate smart agriculture is really this effort to transform the agricultural system globally. And the goal is to sustainably increase agricultural productivity, because still population is increasing and the food demand will increase. But we also need to adapt and build a resilient systems that can withstand droughts, that can withstand heat waves, and so forth. And at the same time, we need to mitigate climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Just as an example, the USDA recently invested $2.8 billion in the US for climate smart commodities. Here in Texas A&M received $65 million to apply climate smart practices throughout Texas. So fingers crossed, we are hopeful that things will change and that we have positive results. But the truth is that we still don't know. So similar to the nutrition problem, we don't have enough data to really to answer many questions there. Okay. So climate smart problem from an engineering perspective has new challenges, which is we need to consider climate objectives. So when we design practices in agriculture, not only we want to have maximum productivity, we want to limit water use, we want to limit the use of fertilizers, but we also want to be aware of the changes in climate. So we want to adapt and be able to grow without water, or we want to be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that's really a challenge. It's a challenge because it requires really understanding how, for example, irrigation affects not only the plant growth, but affects also the microbiome of the soil. Or same for fertilization. If we add these fertilizers in the soil, this is going to change how microbes live in the soil, if they are healthy or not, and so forth. And then that requires us engineers, and of course, to put together not only our engineering skills, but we need to understand a little bit of microbiology, biochemistry, hydrology, thermodynamics, and the list goes on. And of course, we cannot do it by ourselves. So this really calls for a lot of collaboration. So collaborations between scientists is increasing, and that's a good thing. At the same time, we are starting to have more and more data that we can use. For example, satellites or planes or drones, and all of these systems, they give us so much data that finally we can try to assimilate to really start providing some answers. I just want to give one example, if I have time, of what it means to mitigate climate change from an agricultural perspective. And I want to talk about rice fields because they are an important contributor of greenhouse gas emissions because they produce methane. The reason why they produce methane is because rice, if you have seen rice plantations, they are beautiful. They are grown under flooded conditions. So you will just see essentially a wetland with plants growing, and that's rice. Now, soil inundation, that leads to some microbes that produce methane being so happy that they produce so much. And so inundation is the problem. But that's how rice is grown because many reasons really about invasive species, and also rice is very sensitive to water stress, so it needs a lot of water. But we don't want to reduce rice production. We like paellas, for example, right? So we want to keep eating rice. We don't want to cut rice production. So what can we do about it? Well, it turns out that farmers kind of knew the answer already. So farmers can be incredibly knowledgeable without looking at the data. But if you see that's the only technical graph I have. But if you see that graph at the top, those points are how much methane is produced during the season. And you can see that there is a peak in the middle of the season. And that's because plants and the soil are collaborating to produce methane. And what farmers do, they don't do it for the methane, but they do it for the plant. What they do is that at some point in the middle of the season, they drain the field, so remove all of that water. And then they apply it again over after 2 days or so. And that leads to an important reduction in methane emissions. Now, they are doing it for the plant because they realize that if they drain once, the plant grows better. But it turns out that if you actually measure the emissions, that leads to an important reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, in this case methane. So sometimes the answer is really very close. What we can do as engineers, we can really study this process a little better and tell them exactly when to do it. And in fact, if you tell them when to drain, because maybe they just do it randomly. They know that one day is sunny, and they have time, they go and they do it. But maybe if we can tell them, but do it at day 50 after you plant the rice, then they will do it. And the result is that not only you have a positive effect on rice, but you also reduce emissions. And we can reduce emissions by 35 up to 45%, depends on the rice crop. So good news there. So to conclude, just 3 key points from my brief presentation, which is, it is critical to transform now agricultural systems more than ever. And we now hear in the news every day all the problems that we are facing. And the agricultural systems, they need to become more sustainable. But sustainable, what it means now is different from what it meant 10 years ago. Because now being sustainable, it means also that you have to adapt to climate change and you need to mitigate climate change. And lastly, because now we have to be climate aware and climate smart, we have to, our engineering problems are becoming extremely complex. And so we really have to collaborate with many scientists, and we have to try to think outside of the box. So that would be all for today. I'll take any questions.
I have one observation and one question. So the observation is, I've been in biological sciences for 60 years now, and I'm definitely got a clue about it. So if we poke a whale in the Pacific, something happened in the Mediterranean, we don't have a clue. But my concern is that, I live in this very high-tech biomedical environment where we have all this instrumentation technology, and I don't see that much of either the people or the technology in these very important fields. I mean, how can we keep up when it's in the entire rest of the world?
That's a very good question. And of course, we try to do our best, but that's why, as I say here, it's really becoming an interdisciplinary approach. So there are many people who made it to field, and they do it everywhere in the world. They do it, they consider different outcomes. There are people who study plants, and they try to do their best there. And they work in the lab, and actually the industry of plant genomics is also huge in that. And then there are engineers, like maybe working on helping farmers, maybe, and helping managers to better use natural resources. And we have a lot of data actually now coming, but it's different from the data that we see in the lab. So we deal with satellite data, for example, and they give us an idea of what happens globally. And many other forms of data, but I haven't shown it here, but actually most of my job, for example, is not always about how to improve these processes, but it's about how to make the little data that we have useful. So it's all of those challenges that go from getting the data to providing us solutions, all those challenges in between, that's where we are working. But at the same time, we have to try to take some steps forward to make sure that we at least try to do something given the emergency that we are already in.
So my question is that we spent a lot of time talking about water resources and variety of things, but the earth is 75 or something percent water. So what about desalinization plants? Can you tell us your environment on, or at least some discussion of the program?
Yeah, it's expensive. That's the problem sometimes. Desalinization is expensive. And you do it where you have salt water.
Nothing to drink, it's cheap.
Well, that is true. That is true. But in fact, we never could say one technology is better than others, and you should go with this and through the others. It really depends on the social economy. So in places like, for example, here in Texas, there are things that we can do that we can improve management of our resources without having to deal with desalinization. In other places, desalinization is enough. But it really depends on the social system. And again, it goes back to looking at this problem as a transdisciplinary problem where we have to consider all angles. And the solution is always case specific. No.
That's the problem of water shortage is more limited than the problem of CO2 levels in our atmosphere. So what kind of solutions do exist in agriculture in order to reduce the use of water for irrigation so that the family manage to alleviate this unacceptable water shortage is not irrigation?
So I'll repeat the question just to make sure I heard it correctly, maybe because the microphone is far away. So you were saying, in the case of water scarcity, what can we do in agriculture to, for example, limit the use of water? That was great. There are many things. The first thing that we can do is can be as simple as changing when you irrigate. That can change considerably how much water you use to evaporation, for example, or giving the right amount of water at the right time. And that requires, of course, an understanding of the soil and the plant, but that's what we do. We try to put all of these aspects together so that we can predict what is the best time, the right amount of water to give, so that you only provide the water that's needed, and you don't lose anything to the environment. That's one thing. Other things, when that is not even enough, then you have to consider sometimes changing crop types and use crops that are more resistant to water stress. So you cannot grow rice or this that rice in New Mexico. You don't do it, right? Because of course it's going to need to, you have to collect to get water from somewhere else and move it there. So this is another thing you can do. Another option, someone mentioned GMOs, we mentioned, or we also mentioned genetics and breeding. There are also other things that we can do to limit the water requirement of crops, so that we can provide less water and the crop just fine.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I can get on to the closing remarks. First of all, thank you everybody for attending tonight this very interesting panel of speakers and panel of interesting arguments. And I really thank you, the Consulate General and the consulate, to organize this special moment of community and education for us, for the general public, to put together the community and